So where we've been left off is we're sort of considering these algorithms that are sort of used in the space of, so in the muddiest points, people say, well, a couple people said, well, where are these things applied? And I'd say that like the field of engineering design optimization is one where you see these types of things coming up a lot. So EDO, or just design optimization. And so these are spaces where there are where you've got difficult problems that might involve complicated functions that you need to optimize. These functions could be models for things like models for jet engines, models for manufacturing systems, models for whole planes. But you have some model that you're confident captures some salient features of a system, but you've got a lot of degrees of freedom left, and so you'd like to optimize over that space. How many rooms do I need in a building? What is the tensile strength I need for these particular components? You have all these different parameters, and some that can't be picked independently from the others, so it's not quite clear which ones to do, but you at least have a model of how they work, and so you'd like to then use that model to optimize over it, and so have the computer to sort of guess that, well, these are the right parameters for your engineering design. Your model that you might be optimizing might be a simulation, it might not be mathematically formed, or it might actually be a physical system. So you have an automated way of trying out parameters in a physical system and taking info back from that and figuring out how to change those. And so that's the context that we're in right now. And for a lot of these problems, there's no easy mathematical framework for this. And so then we use these evolutionary meta-heuristics. And so we said that these evolutionary algorithms, or I'll just do this. So these evolutionary algorithms are inspired by the general process of evolution from a biologist's perspective. And here, evolution represents a change in distribution of strategies over time. So the key point in an evolutionary algorithm, and then we're going to be talking about the GA specifically today, is that you have a population of candidate strategies that you would like to evaluate. And so you've got that population, you're going to evaluate everybody in that population, and then based on how well those strategies do, and by strategies I mean these candidate settings for these parameters in this model that you're trying to optimize. And so based on how well they do, then we're going to assign each strategy something that we're broadly going to be calling a fitness, which in a biological perspective would be so how many offspring a particular individual would have based on some phenotype. And so if you've got blue eyes, how many offspring do you have? If you've got brown eyes, how many offspring do you have? Well, blue eyes and brown eyes, you probably have on average the same number of offspring. Maybe there's some preference for it, but let's just say that there's no preference for those. And so in that case, they both have an average fitness, so maybe they both have on average 1.8 offspring. But the key difference, or the key thing is how do those fitnesses compare? And so that's why normally you take fitness and you can sort of say fitness of a strategy, but then you can normalize by how many individuals have that strategy, and then that becomes kind of a per individual fitness, and then we talk about relative fitness. And relative fitness is basically if you're an individual with that strategy, how many offspring do you have normalized by how many offspring does the average strategy have? And so relative fitness is this term that is used in biology and in these evolutionary algorithms to be the force that changes these distributions over time. So if you have differences in your if everybody's relative fitness is 1, then the distributions are basically stable. But if you put a selective pressure on the population, that's going to cause some individuals to be at a disadvantage, And then relatively, then some individuals will be at an advantage. And that will mean that over time, you'll see fewer individuals with the disadvantage and more individuals with the advantage. And so at least at a temporary period, the distribution of strategies will shift, hopefully, towards the ones that are the better strategy, or the strategy that provides more benefit. And that's the basic insight behind these evolutionary algorithms. And so, but then that gets into, so there's this selective pressure that this relative fitness is related to. And that is what brought up this notion of drift. So I'll draw a little diagram here. So this selective pressure is somehow related to diversity. If you have a diverse set of strategies, and each strategy has a diverse set of performances, so some strategies are better than the others, then some strategies will have a high relative fitness, and other strategies will have a low relative fitness. And that puts selective pressure on the population to shift its distribution towards strategies that we view as more beneficial from an engineering design perspective. Now, the problem with these algorithms is this relationship to diversity. So there is, if I were to draw, and this is just a plot that I made up, so take it for what it's worth. If I were to draw this kind of two axes here, where I put selective pressure on one axis, and I were to put effectiveness, so this is going to bleed over the axes, of an evolutionary algorithm on this axis here, then what I end up getting is kind of this sweet spot inverted U-shaped curve. And so what this is saying here is that when you have no selective pressure, now what do I mean by no selective pressure? Well, another way to write that is selective pressure is actually related to population diversity. So if I have no diversity in my population, everyone's the same, then my population will stagnate. It will not move, regardless of whether there are better strategies out there, because there is low population diversity. So over here, I can say in this direction, this is low population diversity. And here, you're prone to stagnation. And when a population fixates, or fixes, I'll say fixes, then that is an outcome of what we call genetic drift. So genetic drift is due to low population diversity, you get, just due to random selection, you can get even lower population diversity. And then you end up drifting towards fixation, which is this point here. And at this point, when everyone is identical, then the population loses its ability as a population to search the strategy space. So the evolutionary algorithm does not work unless you've got a source of diversity. But on the flip side of that, when you've got high population diversity, that also can be bad. Because this is where you've got premature convergence. So over here, in this condition, that's when you have premature convergence. And this is, to basically suboptimal solutions. So basically, if you have really, really high population diversity, there's going to be some individuals that are so much better than others that they are going to dominate the next population. Now, they may not be good in a global sense, but locally, they're better than all the rest. So this is where sometimes people refer to these as conditions as being satisficing. Like, as long as you're sufficiently good to dominate all the rest, then you're guaranteed to get your genes into the next population. You don't have to be the best. And that's kind of the condition here. You're at a local optima, but not necessarily at a global optima. And the trick is that if I were to kind of view this as a parametric plot, if you start with high population diversity, and then gradually, as you select out individuals that are at the bottom of the list, you'll move towards low population diversity. So I could put little arrows here that kind of show the trajectory of this thing over time. And so we can see that you might start with a lot of diversity, and that you're going to climb some gradient and get, hopefully close to an optimal point. But as you do that, your solutions start looking more and more similar, There'll be sort of a sweet spot here where you're going to explore, hopefully, if we're minimizing the bottom of that function pretty well, and hopefully be able to find it, in high resolution. But it'll just be a local optima because it was kind of initially driven by this rapid search for, this local search. And then eventually the selection pressure dies off because you don't have diversity, and then genetic drift picks up. And at this point, you're basically randomly selecting one of an arbitrary set. Question?
Can we control the population diversity by just adding in more strategies?
Well, so, I guess I would say more generally, our goal as algorithm designers is to try to stay in this spot. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is we're going to introduce the formal genetic algorithm and the different operators that you can put in the genetic algorithm that, based on choices of parameters there, will try to keep the population here. And you can do things like dynamically scaling fitness as you're moving around, so that as the global fitness kind of gets compressed, then you can rescale it and kind of amplify those differences again. So there's different things you can do, but your goal is to try to keep in this sweet spot where you maintain some diversity, but not so much diversity that one individual goes into taking the whole population with them. And so that's kind of our goal, is to be in this ideal region. Maybe I'll do a different color here. So the goal is to be in this sort of region here. So it's sort of some ideal balance. And we can, choose hyperparameters to do that. So, hyperparameters, this term, we're optimizing parameters of the design optimization problem, but our optimizer has parameters, and so we need to optimize our optimizer, thus a hyperparameter, and we are going to try to choose the hyperparameters that hopefully achieve this balance where we maintain diversity while not just finding the local optimum and just exploiting that. So we do both. Yeah.
If we are too diverse, how we can have some candidate that's gonna be dominant.
Right.
Because how this happens, because if it's too diverse, this means the probability of this candidate of choosing it's gonna be low, right? So.
Well, what happens if it's too diverse? If there's one candidate that's going to dominate, it may immediately, it'll go from having a representation of 1/10 of the population, but if its fitness is so large relative to the others, then randomly you immediately can jump from having a extremely diverse population to that one individual just killing off all the rest, and then suddenly you've just a population of one.
And how being in the middle will reduce the chances of this happening?
How
being in the middle will reduce the chances.
So if you're in the middle, then the idea is you've got enough diverse strategies that there will be differences in fitness that will cause the population to keep churning.
Okay.
And so that's where you need this, but you're not, but not too much, because you end up dragging a population away from. So this is almost like an exploration-exploitation trade-off. And so here, you're going to exploit any local optima you can find. Here, you're just going to kind of exploit wherever the heck you are. And in order for us to kind of, explore, we need some sort of mixture of those so that we have a tension that allows us to move around.
Okay.
Yeah.
But if we see towards the left end of the graph, that's when the score of the fitness score of population on the whole is going to be the highest.
On the, what do you mean, on the left side of the graph?
Yes, when we reach that point, wherein the guy who had the dominant genes has dominated everyone, the fitness score of the population as the whole is going to be highest. Isn't that the goal of evolution in the first place? To reach the highest possible fitness score for the population.
Oh, well, this isn't necessarily the highest. I mean, the point here is that you can have situations where, I mean, if I were to draw a hypothetical optimization objective, and how this maps to fitness we'll make more concrete today, but if I were to draw an optimization objective where, you know, I've just got one single parameter in my design problem x and some f of x here, and that optimization objective, you know, maybe has got a bunch of different, you know, peaks and valleys. And let's say I'm trying to maximize f of x. So I'll do minimize since that's what we've been doing. Then the thought here is that you've got a bunch of these local, well, now it's hard to tell which one's which, but let's just pretend that this over here is the global. So that's where we want to be. But if the population starts, let's say, on this hill over here, we've got a diverse set of strategies and a diverse set of, so we've got a diverse set of strategies and a diverse set of fitnesses, and that diversity is going to allow this individual here to be able to dominate relative to these others, and it's going to push the population to the wrong direction. Because ideally, we'd like to somehow be moving here. So somehow we need to maintain enough population diversity, but then the downside is on the left side of this graph up here, there can be these weird points where, like, if I happen to initialize everybody right about here, almost all on top of each other, then, and this is not meant to be an inflection point, it's just meant to be an arbitrary point, then even there's so little fitness difference that in the next population I basically get the same, but then when I randomly resample them, I accidentally might just pick all of one strategy. And then I just get stuck here for no good reason. So that's, so I guess this here is the drift case. And over here, this is the premature convergence case, convergence case. Yeah.
Can you please explain what a selection pressure is, like the definition of it? Because I cannot relate how it is related to the population diversity. Like, is it proportional to it, or is it a factor of it, and other things as well?
Sure. So I mean, selection pressure is the it's usually defined in terms of how these populations change, and so if you know the distribution of strategies in one population and the distribution of strategies in the next population, you can write how they've changed from one generation to the next. And the selection pressure is going to be a measure of how one group has grown much more than the other groups.
Okay.
So
does it relate to, is it directly proportional to population diversity? Because I can see that you have written it on the x-axis, like both of them are on the x-axis, like.
You can think of these, typically you can almost always think of these as analogs of each other. So high diversity means there's probably high selective pressure. So long as the diverse number of individuals in the population also map to diverse fitnesses, diverse performances. So if you have a diversity in performance, you've got high selection pressure because one individual will outperform a lot of the rest.
So it's so one of the individual is gonna have a higher selection pressure coordinate.
Selection pressure is like a property of the population. So we'd say like, is there a lot of, so let's just say that, that suddenly, like today, we're all in different colored shirts. But tomorrow, for some reason, something weird happens in the building, and everyone wearing a green shirt has suddenly a 90% chance of dying, and everyone else is fine. So I've gone from having no diversity in our fitness to suddenly the next day having a huge diversity in fitness. Everybody wearing a green shirt. So everyone is fine, or is not fine. Everybody not wearing a green shirt is fine. So suddenly I put a huge cost of wearing a green shirt. And by spreading out the likely fitness, because now everybody in a green shirt is not going to pass on their genes, I have created, that sort of goes hand in hand with now there's selection pressure. So there was no pressure on shirt color before. But then the day after, I have put a pressure on shirt color. And what I mean by I've put a pressure on shirt color is now if you go across the different strategies, the different shirt colors, some shirts are going to fare much, much better than others. And so when there is a diversity in performance across strategy space, then I say there's high selection pressure. Okay. Yeah.
So is the effectiveness of EA like the probability that we're gonna get a higher fitness from the next offspring?
I would say the effectiveness of the EA from an engineer design standpoint is the likelihood that my EA is actually going to find the global optimum.
Okay. And at each operation? Oh.
I would say at each run, so the EA is eventually going to converge. And so if I were to run the EA once and then it gives me an answer, and I were to run the EA like 1,000 times, I could say what proportion of those EA runs actually found the global. And this would be my sort of qualitative shape of like how likely it would be to actually find the global. Yeah.
You just said that selection pressure will make us have less choices, right?
It will cause us to too rapidly converge on one choice.
So how come when selective pressure increases, population diversity increases? Shouldn't it be the opposite way around?
Well, I would say as population diversity increases, selection pressure increases because there's selection pressure is a measure of what's going to happen to the distribution next. And so if we have a diverse number of performances, then we now have a lot of different things to compare to, and there's a lot of opportunity for one strategy to have more representation in the next generation than other strategies. So selection pressure is just a measurement of how strategies grow relative to the rest of the population. And so that's just a term that we use, selection pressure, which has to do with that. Hold on.
So can we not write it as diversity of performance instead of diversity of population?
Yeah, if you'd like, you can call it diversity of performance. That would be a fine, that's fine to write it that way, yes. And the claim is that because there is that a diversity of performance necessarily means there's a diversity in population as well. It's not necessarily the other way around. So you can definitely have like shirt color, and maybe that shirt color doesn't, any shirt will do. So some things just don't matter. Okay. All right, so let's move on, and I think some answers will be answered as we go on here. Good notes. All right. So the question is then, how do we implement a GA specifically as an engineering design optimization tool? So this is our sort of focal example, a common example of an EA is this, just maybe draw a line here. So our EA example is a basic genetic algorithm. So I'm going to say the genetic algorithm. These are algorithms that have been very successful. Civil engineers really love these things. You'll find that at least to come up with the first set of parameters before they certify that they're going to work, like bridges and infrastructure systems and all these are very complex systems, and a lot of times they don't know where to start, so they use GAs to find the kind of initial things and then use other modeling things to kind of show that maybe these things will work. So a lot of these high order complex systems with lots of parameters, and people often will use things like GAs to solve. And so the basic structure And maybe I'll just flip to a new page so I have a full deck here. And this is almost like a vocabulary here. So the basic structure is like, how do we represent a decision variable in a GA? So decision variable, these are the things that we're optimizing. So we can view this as a component of the decision vector, and that is a gene of the chromosome. So the decision vector then, so I'll just do decision vector, is going to be the chromosome. And so when I say that the decision variable is a gene, numerically, for computational reasons, sometimes we break the decision variable up into like into its base 10 places, and the actual places of the decision variable can be like subvariables. And so, in the homework, the 1B, I think I asked you in the first one to break things up into place values, base 10 place values, but in the second one to compare to, I just effectively say that your decision variable can't be like a single, your decision variable in the real world can just be the whole gene. And so my gene doesn't, there's a bunch of different ways to encode those genes, and we'll go over that. But basically the idea here is we have something in the real world, a decision variable we're going to call a gene. The thing that can vary is what we call a gene, and the collection of them together is what we're calling a chromosome. And so a particular set of solutions, so I'll say a particular candidate solution, I'm calling a genotype.
Professor?
Yeah, sorry.
Could that also be a strategy then?
Yes, right. So a candidate solution is another term for strategy. So, I'm not particularly sure. I'm going to set these moisture values in this concrete drying problem to this particular thing, and so that is a candidate solution, and I instantiate that by setting up certain genes in the chromosome, and those particular values of genes collected together into a particular chromosome is my genotype. And so the old solutions in my generations, we are just going to be calling parents, and the next solutions, the new solutions in the algorithm, we'll call offspring or children. And then occasionally, although I only will mention it at the end here, we'll collect the best solutions in a generation and treat them differently to kind of make sure that they're not lost. And those best solutions we'll call elites. So there's not necessarily a biological analog to this, but elitism is a strategy used in a lot of evolutionary algorithms, particularly genetic algorithms. So that's where this elite, that's what that term is. Now the fitness function, that is a measure of quality of each strategy that is in terms of the optimization objective. And so we'll see what I mean by that as we define selection operators, but basically just cutting ahead a little bit, you can think of a fitness function conceptually as being equivalent to the optimization objective. But then you can think, well, some optimization objectives are positive, some are negative. So if I really want to think in terms of fitness, fitness is something that really needs to be a positive number. And we'll see in these selection operators, many of them depend upon it being positive. So we usually have some sort of mapping from our optimization objective to the fitness function. And that mapping allows us to toy with things that help keep in that sweet spot where we've got kind of the maximal effectiveness of the evolutionary algorithm. So you might have instead of a linear mapping between the optimization objective and the fitness function, you might have some S-shaped mapping, or maybe something else that magnifies things or brings some differences down, or so on and so forth. You might just have a shift in order to make your optimization objective positive, you might just add a constant to it, and that becomes your fitness function. So fitness, generally, we view as usually, we view this as being greater than or equal to 0, even though the optimization objective is not. So there is some mapping that happens there. Then we have an initial solution. So we generate a population of initial solutions, and we usually just draw them randomly. So we can view that as a random genotype. Now here, you might decide that you want your initial solutions to start in a particular area. So of course you can craft these, and that will be kind of another type of hyperparameters where you're going to put these initial solutions. But just conceptually, we can view them as just distributed randomly. Yeah.
Professor, what's the difference between candidate solution and initial solution?
Well, okay, so a candidate solution is throughout the execution of the algorithm. Initial solution is just how do we get these candidates to begin with? And we're going to say in a genetic algorithm, we just generate them randomly.
So they could be same as well, but it's just that initial solution will change and that set will just remain fixed.
Right, right. So the initial solution is just how we get our initial candidates, and then we'll often forget about the initial solutions after the first generation. Yeah.
So when you say a solution, do you mean a single genotype or the whole population?
Oh, good question. So here, the term solution is a single member of a population, so a single genotype. So I have a population of genotypes, and as a designer, I will look at the population and choose the best among them. But each one of them is a potential solution I could try. Yeah. Well, I would say that we'll talk about encodings, and next week we're going to talk about things like genetic programming. So you can use this framework to build programs for you, in which case your genes have to be able to be assembled in a way that makes syntactic sense. And so in that case, they're not going to necessarily be scalars, but for the purpose of this algorithm, yes, then think of the gene as a scalar, but just put in the back of your mind, there are other ways to encode genes so that we can do more interesting things. Anything else? Terminology? All right. So then selection. The process of selection is basically choosing surviving parents. Choosing your red shirts and your green shirts. I guess in the Star Trek analogy, I should have chosen red as but whatever. And then the last one is the process of generating new solutions. These will be our so-called genetic operators. And the two genetic operators that we worry about are mutation and selection. And so what we're going to see here is I'll outline an algorithm where at a particular spot, I'll say, call your selection operator. And then at another spot, I'll say, call your mutation operator. And then we'll then talk about different ways to do selection and mutation. So you can have a basic genetic algorithm, but then function handles where you can throw in your own choices for how to do selection and mutation that might vary on the particular problem that you're doing. So I'm going to show you some basic ones here, but know that there's an extra degree of freedom for you here that you can implement different selection operators and mutation operators. But basically the structure of how you evolve the populations is going to be the same. Yeah.
So then is toggling the mutation and selection how you apply this to many different engineering applications?
Well, I would say that you can, of course, as long as your decision variables are sort of have the right constraints, the right domains, you can apply this to any problem, but its effectiveness may require you to have a different mutation structure or selection. All right, any questions about terminology here? Yeah.
What about mutation?
What about mutation?
Yeah, you defined everything else.
Oh, what do I mean by mutation? I see. We'll get into that, but basically, in the way in which we generate new offspring from parents, there will be two mechanisms for that I am calling right now as placeholders: mutation and selection. And selection is choosing surviving parents, and basically mutation is how we take the offspring from those parents and make them different from their parents. Anything else? All right, so let's then, the next kind of thing here is decision variable encoding. And I will post all of these notes on Canvas. Decision variable encoding is, conceptually, you can think one gene to one variable. In other words, if I have a chromosome, encoding a genotype, so my chromosome might look like this, all the way up to, in genes in a chromosome, and then each one of these things, like X1, might be equal to a continuous scalar value. So this gene could be anything on the real line. The next gene might not be anything on the. So it might be that the X1. So this is supposed to be X1 is in the half line. X2 is bounded between 0 and 1. X3 is, and so on and so forth. And this is just the Cartesian product of those. So this is, one way that we can think of these things. But very often, we want our genetic algorithm to kind of be able to do more interesting things. And that's why we further divide these things up numerically so that the genes are actually like the places of these things. And so as to break that up, I can say, well, what if my X1 was actually either a +1 or a -1? X2 was equal to, any number between 0 and 9. X3 is equal to any number between 0 and 9. X4, any number between 0 and 9. So that my genotype here would be equal to, say, that. So now I've taken this scalar and I've broken it up according to these base 10 places. And I've said this can be 1 or 0, which I'm just depicting as a plus or a minus here. Not 1 or 0. So the first bit can be 1 or -1, which I'm just depicting as plus or minus. The second one is whatever's in the tens place, the tenths place, and the 100 place. And that becomes my genotype. And by breaking things up this way, what you're doing is you're allowing the genetic algorithm to remember the most significant bits as being kind of a good place to be, and then allowing it to play with the least significant bits. So it allows you kind of a Vernier knob that allows your optimization algorithm to more finely tune things rather than having to sort of come up with a total random flip here. Because now this will make the algorithm simpler to implement, because due to recombination, you might end up finding that all of your parents end up keeping these top 3 bits, these most significant parts, but they end up just evolving this last bit over and over again. So this ends up being the part that changes over and over. So it's a way of helping to remember these upper bits right here. It makes it more complicated to implement, but sometimes it makes your algorithms much more effective, because you can end up kind of zooming in on these lower precision, or these higher precision, so these lower order pieces of it. So we'll see what I mean by that. But do these two encodings make sense to you? Is that you can either put a bunch of scalars together, or you can further divide the scalars up so that now you've got all of their places, and maybe just up to, maybe this is all it. You just have these 4. So you might have 4 genes within a certain scalar, and then you might have 4 scalars, so that the whole genotype is actually 16 different spaces.
So these are 2 encoding methodologies?
That's right. These are 2 ways of encoding. So, pardon me? Pardon me? Say-
Do they have names or?
I mean, I would actually say that this is a generalization of that one. So technically, I think these both can be viewed as the same type of encoding. It's just here, I'm encoding everything in one, and here I'm breaking them up. So, I mean, they may have names, but I don't have names for them because I view them as just kind of two different choices along a continuum. All right. So these encodings, they make sense?
So like we basically collimate or like restrict the initial variables to some extent,
Mhm.
and we allow the range to be more for fine tuning. Is that what you want to say?
Well, that's kind of what we're saying here is that this does discretize and this does quantize things a bit by forcing things to kind of be viewed in this kind of base 10 perspective. But the hope here is that if you're really interested in fine tuning a solution, then this allows your algorithm to sort of, so you can imagine that, well, we'll learn about crossover here, but the algorithm basically can work on these different genes separately. And once it kind of decides that this gene is a good one, this gene is a good one, this gene is a good one, we haven't quite figured out the best value for this gene yet, then it can just kind of iterate over here, but it keeps all of this stuff around. So it's a way in which your algorithm can start coarsely looking over the entire space, and then towards the end of the algorithm, refine to only look at this piece here. Any other questions? Yeah.
What if at the more significant bit it lands to a local minima or something like that, and so that in the first type it may have a chance to shift itself, but
Right.
for the second case it will never have.
Right, I mean, that goes back to like, how do we, that's gonna go into how do we build these mutation and selection operators to try to prevent that. So you're right that what could happen is that everyone with a 1 in the tens place here ends up dominating everybody else just because nobody else happens to be in an even better spot. And then gradually the whole population gets these two things, in which case we might be stuck. So there are mechanisms that you can do in your selection operator, for example, that would prevent that from happening, so you keep around some diversity. So there is you can think of it as speciation. You can actually have little subsets that are restricted to kind of search on their own, even though you've got this other subset exploring here. So, but the default vanilla off-the-shelf genetic algorithm, that can be a major problem. All right, well, let's keep moving on. So we have this, we know, we've got the basic idea here of what terms we're using. And then down here we have this encoding that we can implement. And I have a little note on Canvas on if you're sort of unclear how to implement this. There's a bunch of different ways you could implement this. And I posted a little note of like 3 different ways you could write this in code. And then so how do you build the rest of your code? So again, I might, for my purposes, just give myself a fresh page here. And so the basic GA flow, which I'll write on the left, is you start, you generate your initial population. You then select parents, which is you're basically choosing a subset of that population. You then reproduce only the parents you reproduce. So we'll go into detail on each one of these steps. Then you ask, did I hit my termination criteria? And if not, you go back up and do the selection again. And if so, if you did, then you report the last generation and you end. So that's the basic flow of every genetic algorithm. It's something along these lines. And then we'll focus here on these modules that we can help start specializing for each genetic algorithm. But this is the basic loop for any GA. And then so I'm going to report this whole last population here, this last generation, and then it'll be up to, and I could, do something where I take the one with the max performance or whatever, but usually there's not that many of these running around, so you can just report the whole population to someone, and then they might be interested in the designer might be interested in looking at the diversity of those solutions. So why reduce the info if you just give them the whole thing for free? So how do you generate this initial population? Well, it's often convenient to just represent this as a matrix, and that matrix will have a number of the columns are going to be the genes and the rows are going to be the individuals. So I can have X11 up here, X1 in down here, M1 and XM in. And so again, I've got M individuals and N genes. And so initially, I might just draw all of these entries randomly. That's the simple way to do it. Making sure I don't draw them, making sure they're feasible. So you've got some feasible set, and you have to worry about all of that. So just brushing that under the rug for now. So that's that portion, easy. So then for selection of parents, I'm going to introduce a hyperparameter. So I've got M total. So one hyperparameter, if I keep track of that, is this M. And you could argue that your encoding imposes another hyperparameter. So how you encode the solutions also has to do with how the formula is performed. So I guess I might put a little dotted mark around this N here, because that's a choice you can make as well. Then the next hyperparameter is choosing what subset of this population is going to get to reproduce. So basically, I'm going to then subset the population up into two groups. So I choose R individuals, R less than M, for reproduction. And again, we'll define these in more detail as we go. And sometimes this is referred to as the breeding population. Or you can refer to these as breeders. So basically, if I've got all of my M individuals total in my population, I am going to have R parents, or R potential parents. They don't necessarily all breed, but they're the only ones that get the opportunity to breed. And then M minus R offspring. And so basically, in the way this model works, there's going to be some individuals that just pass right on down through. And then there's another set of individuals that just get killed off, and then their spots get taken over by individuals that are derived from the parents. And so it is the mutation and selection operators. So the selection operator, that's what we're defining now, selects these parents. And then there's going to be a recombination step, which we'll get into here in a second, that defines the offspring here. And then those offspring all get mutated to be a little bit different. And then that makes up the new population. So that's kind of just the selection step. And again, we'll go into detail on these. And then the reproduction step, that's where we do this crossover, which is the numerical version of sex, and then mutation. And so this crossover is, you can view it as breeding, or you can actually view it as interpolation or extrapolation. And then mutation is just variation. So the genius, or whatever, the supposed genius behind genetic algorithms, before genetic algorithms, people were doing metaheuristics that focused on just the analog for mutation. We're going to do a stochastic search over strategies. We're going to take strategies that worked well, we'll vary them a little bit, and we'll get new strategies out, and that's how we'll search the space. The genetic algorithm's real contribution to the existing population literature was this crossover idea. This idea that if I have two solutions, can I create an operator which basically takes those two solutions and draws a line and chooses offspring that are on that line, maybe in between the two, maybe outside of the two, but it basically interpolates or extrapolates between two solutions what we've already determined to be kind of good. So that kind of blends these two as opposed to just randomly perturbing them. So that's the basic idea there. So that's the basic genetic algorithm. So from here on out, we're going to drill down into the selection operators and then the crossover and mutation. Any questions about this basic outline for a GA? Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry.
The count of m individuals. Yeah,
Yes.
that has to be maintained across iterations, right? So what we are doing is we are selecting parents and then m minus r offsprings. So the count of m is maintained.
In this version, there are other versions of the genetic algorithm change the number, but in most basic genetic algorithms, yes.
Yeah, so the m is maintained. My question is, why do we have to retain the parents? Because the genes are getting, we could have just had m offsprings because their genes are getting passed anyways.
We could have m offspring. So you're saying, why don't we just select parents, get rid of the parents, and then just do
Have
this?
just the offsprings.
Well, and that, you could build it. This is the kind of more canonical GA. And in this kind of canonical GA, you sort of say that these parents, the idea is you've got overlapping generations. So it's like, the parents and the offspring coexist for a while, and that allows for and there might be some value here, because these might have been this is like a micro version of elitism. Like, these parents were good in the previous generation, so let's keep them around, see how well the offspring can do. If some of the offspring do better than the parents, we'll kill the parents later. But if the offspring aren't really that great, we'll kill the offspring and try again. It's real life, right? So, all right, so different selection. Yeah, question?
So after the reproduced step, do we get more than m individuals or?
Good question. So I'll show you different selection operators that they all mimic the basic expansion and contraction that I was talking about the last lecture, where you get more and then you reduce. That's the mimicry of it. Some of the selection operators actually do that, but most of them just find a way to choose like a probability of getting into here and then adjust the probability based on the relative fitness. So in that case, you don't ever actually generate more and then shrink. You can do that, but most of them just for, it just makes more sense for storage in the algorithm not to have to suddenly generate a whole bunch more solutions and then prune them down if you can just jump straight across. Yeah.
Is there, can we here know what about the selection pressure? Or
Yeah, so the
can we see
selection
here?
pressure. Yeah, so this selection operators, each one of them will have its own little parameter that allows you to kind of adjust how much selection pressure, or kind of the effect of the selection pressure. But so that gets implemented inside the different selection operators, and we're about to talk about those.
Okay.
So it's buried in here.
Okay.
Like, we'll basically evaluate the fitness and then have it sorted out.
Yeah, that's what we're about to see right now. So let's at least get to some of those. So there are different ways that we can do selection. Tool to add page, there we go. We'll do proportionate selection first. So how to choose, well, maybe not red. So there's a separate question of how to choose R. And so that's a hyperparameter. I'm not going to worry about that. But then once I've chosen R for the algorithm, how do I actually choose those who gets to be the R breeders? And so the simplest case is so-called proportionate selection, which is I think what most people think of And so in this case, I create a fitness function which I will use as capital F, and it maps the optimization objective onto a positive number. So the basic idea here is if I want to do like, so I'll just say maps F onto a positive number. So that's my optimization objective. That's positive numbers. And so, for example, these are just examples, common examples, but just examples. There's lots of different ways to do this. Then I can say that, well, for example, F of, if K, so K is my kth individual in the population. So I can say that the fitness is going to be plus some constant, and this is in the case of maximization. So if I want to maximize an optimization objective, if I know a big enough constant to shift to this, to guarantee that over my space, my decision space, this stays positive, then that's just a simple way to do it. If I want to do minimization, I just kind of flip that around, and I could do the same constant minus f of x instead. And these are just two examples. You can come up with other ways to do that. And there are, like I said, mapping functions that involve selective pressure and things like that that we're not going to sort of get into just yet. But basically, I guess I should just add the note here that selection or selective pressure, or I'll say, sorry, scaling functions, not select. So scaling functions can be used to balance selective pressure. So right now, if there's a tiny difference in the optimization objective, there'll be a tiny difference in the fitness. But you could put a scaling function here so that if there's a tiny difference here, you end up getting a big difference here. So you can imagine lots of different ways to do this mapping. I'm doing the affine mapping here just for simplicity, but you can do a linear mapping, whatever. So there's other things that you could do here. All right, so then what you do is, now that you've able to write the fitness for every strategy, then I come up with a probability, pk, where k for the kth individual, which is just going to be its fitness over the sum of all the fitnesses. So j equal 1 to n. And so, and then basically I do a roulette wheel style a random number draw r times. And so I basically can create, imagine a cumulative probability scale here. I'll explain what I mean by this if you don't know what I mean. So imagine this is like a number line. And this distance here is P1, this distance here is P2, this distance here is P3, this distance here, let's say, is PM. And so the idea here is if I draw a random number, so I'm going to draw some uniformly distributed random number between 0 and 1, and I see where it lands. The interval where it lands tells me what individual to put in the breeding population for that draw. So I can do this r times. So for the first draw, I draw a number, it comes up 0.2. And I see, oh, well, 0.2, that's in this one's interval. So that means that individual 2 is going to get representation in the breeders. Then I draw again, and it comes up 0.2 again. Well, okay, well, then individual 2 gets another representation of the breeders, and so on and so forth. Yeah?
Is that PK the relative fitness?
PK here is, so we could write all that out, and it's going to be proportional to the relative fitness, I think, because the relative fitness is, well, no, I don't want to say it. Technically speaking, the relative fitness is you have to take the fitness and you have to normalize it per the number of individuals that are in the group, and you have to take that and normalize that. So I don't want to use the actual formal term relative fitness. Just think of it as this. So but it is a normalized fitness. Yeah.
I didn't understand PK properly, because if you are saying that it's f of x of k by sigma of that, then wouldn't that mean it is actually relative to the entire population?
It is relative to, yes. I'm just not, the term relative fitness is a formal term that means something very specific from the population literature, so I'm not using that term, but it is a relative fitness. I am just scaling the fitness by the kind of total amount of offspring that are produced and getting a relative fitness. So this is supposed to represent what proportion strategy K has in the next generation. Yeah.
Since we are selecting it randomly, even though say like P2 has probability of selection is very less, even though unfortunately P2 we selected, and it moves on to next generation, and doesn't it affect the next generation fitness? Like, and it can it get probability of selecting for the further generations?
Well, I'm sure, yeah, this is definitely a short-sighted, I mean, the fitness is just defined for this generation, so it's definitely possible that this strategy may not have the same fitness, it may have lower fitness in the next generation. So, I mean, fitness is defined by the optimization objective, so if this strategy goes into the next generation, it may have the same fitness, but it's relative, or its PK in the next generation certainly can be less. That's kind of what drives the whole thing. So this is, the probability that any strategy will get into the breeding population. What proportion of the breeding population is represented by this strategy? As determined, we're assuming that's going to be proportionate to its fitness. Yeah?
How should we choose R?
Choose, R? So for now, for the purpose of the homework, I leave that up to you to sort of experiment with it. And you can say, well, I'm gonna choose a population of 100, I'm gonna choose a breeder of 40, and if that works for you, that's fine. If you're interested in seeing what's gonna happen, you can say, well, what happens if I change it down to 5? What's gonna go to 95? So you feel free to play with that, but I leave that up to you. Yeah.
What do you mean when you say a particular genotype gets multiple differentiations?
So if you think about this, I'm going to do this draw R times. So it is possible that once the strategy, so this draw, I place into the breeding population with replacement. So it's not like I'm taking from the old population and moving them into the breeders. I'm from the old population, I'm saying, okay, so when I drew this random number the first time out of the R, it gave me something here which tells me that, strategy 3, you get in. But then when I draw it again, it's possible that my random number also lands in this interval again, which means strategy 3 is going to get more representation. So there actually is a little bit of reproduction going on here with high fidelity in the breeding population.
So when you say R breeders, you don't mean R genotypes. It can be less than that also.
Yeah, I guess you could say that. There's not R unique genotypes. There are individuals, and some of those individuals may be copies of other individuals.
No, and we just draw our individuals in random. Like we do not have to sort it in a specific order.
No, I mean, for proportionate selection, there's no sorting. The next one that I'll describe, which is ranking selection, you do sort. But for proportionate selection, the mechanism here, there's no sorting that you have to do. You just calculate, you assign every strategy a probability, and then that tells you how you're going to select the breeders.
So we are not going to use this one assignment.
You can use, I give you the option to choose whatever selection operator you'd like. So you may use this one, or you may use a ranking selection method. That's fine too. But you just have to tell me what selection operator you use. Yeah, no, what?
What do we call it if we draw P3 all our types? Like every time we draw, just the one.
Well, I don't know if there's necessarily, I wouldn't call that fixation or anything like that, but it's well, it depends on what the P's are. Of course, if these are all 1.0, then that's very likely that would happen, but it can happen, right? I mean, with this selection method, and that's why proportionate selection is actually very prone to genetic drift, because you can pack the breeders with all the same genotype very quickly. So you can really remove your diversity. All right, well, let's move on. So that's proportionate selection. If you don't like proportionate selection, then it's actually sort of simpler to describe. Then you can go into the family of ranking selection. And so in ranking selection, it has 3 steps. Now I should mention there are a lot of different ways to do ranking selection. This is the basic outline of them, but there are variations here. So I rank my M solutions by the objective, so by optimization objective. So here I don't need to create a fitness function necessarily, but it kind of gets indirectly created in the next step. So then 2, I reproduce each with number of copies proportional to rank. And then I draw uniformly to reduce back to R breeders. And then you could say that if you like here, you could also just assign a probability according to rank. And so here I'm reproducing strictly, deterministically relative to their rank. Alternatively, you could do a ranking selection where you choose a probability of getting into the breeding population, similar to fitness proportional selection. And then that probability ends up being the probability that you end up being in these R breeders. The advantage of going this way is your mapping from rank to probability provides you a lever that you can play with to adjust selective pressure, the same way that in proportionate selection we can do those scaling functions. So you can do the equivalent of a scaling function here. So that's one. So that's ranking selection. Rank, reproduce proportional to rank, and then draw, and then redraw so that you come back to the R breeders. Yeah.
What we just mentioned, the first R.
The first R in the list, rank and then choose R. You could do that, but then effectively what you're doing is you're giving them all equal fitness. So if I rank in terms of the fitness, in terms of their optimization objective, the one at the top of the list did much better than the one next to it. But if I just choose the top R in that list, they all will get equal representation in the breeders. And in the evolutionary algorithm, I might want the ones that did better to produce more breeders than ones that didn't. All right, yeah?
Does this cause some kind of premature conversion?
Well, so ranking selection, what's nice about ranking selection is because you're creating breeders proportionate to rank, and so I'll let you go at 4:20 when the class ends. When you get breeders proportionate to rank, then you actually get rid of some of the absolute differences in fitness. So ranking selection has a natural way that it mitigates the problem of this premature convergence, and even a little bit of drift stuff, because it kind of like it has this quick mapping where you kind of forget about the absolute differences in the fitness objective, and it just is like, how well are you relative to others? Yeah.
Like, this can be a confusion. Does the rank value represent?
Keep going.
I mean, a lower rank value is better than a higher rank value?
Well, okay, so when I say proportionate, I'm okay with you like thinking inversely proportionate as well. So how you rank this sort of thing, it's, you know, whether you say it's 1 in the list or it's M in the list, it's sort of up to kind of your labeling.
So like whichever entry is the fittest is gonna have a rank 1 or a rank like.
Well, so the way you interpret those numbers, as long as the ordering is correct, is all that matters. So if it's easier to think about it, I would say the highest fitness one is rank N, and then it's easiest to interpret it this way.
And so like whichever is having a higher fitness gets amplified more than.
That's right. That's right. So the last one I want to at least get the basic outline here before I let you go is tournament selection, which introduces a different hyperparameter. So we select Y candidates from M, and then we pick the best one, and then that goes into the R breeders. And then we repeat basically R minus 1 times. So repeat until we have, and this is with replacement. And here, Y is a parameter which again can be used to tune for selection pressure. So this tournament selection, so I just, Y is often equal to 2. So I'll say Y often equal to 2. So in that case, I look at my M population, I grab 2 of them at random, I have them do a tournament, so I pick the one best out of the 2. They get to be a breeder. And I do that over and over and over again until I have my R breeders. And that also, by selecting, so this Y is a parameter which helps you adjust the selection pressure. And because it has an aspect of ranking, it also has this nice feature where it is sort of agnostic to how big the difference in the optimization objective is. So that also can be good to prevent stagnation in some cases and premature convergence in the others. So even though my claim is that most of you in your heads would think of a version of proportionate selection, the reason why ranking selection and tournament selection are there is they tend to give us more control over these deleterious issues. So any quick questions? Otherwise I can take the rest of them after. Quick questions?
Selection step, do you select randomly or is there more probability for better?
Well, this is the selection step. And so, and there's aspects of randomness that went into all 3 of these. So you choose one of these and you let these select your R. In the next class, we'll talk about the other operator, crossover and mutation. And crossover and mutation will introduce variation. But this is all that goes on. These are who becomes the breeders. Yeah.
So do we have enough information now to complete the quiz, though?
The 1A for sure. The homework, I am willing to, I'll see what the due date is, and since we haven't got through it yet, I might bump it.
It's like next Friday.
If it's next Friday, I think you'll have plenty of information by the beginning of next class. Like we're like almost to the end of that hour.
Yeah, it's next
well
Wednesday,
then,
right?
next Wednesday? All right, well then I might bump it to next Friday so that you've got time. All right, well that's, I'll let you go now. If you have any other questions, feel free to come up.